Unaware that his pregnant wife was actually the only daughter of Thomas Wellington, the trillionaire whose name appeared on half the buildings downtown, Daniel threw her last piece of luggage into the rain with enough force to crack the leather, while his mistress Victoria laughed from the doorway like this was the entertainment she'd been craving for months. His wife stood in the downpour, her maternity dress clinging to her swollen belly, but she wasn't crying anymore. She was watching them with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read, something that flickered between pity and calculation. For 36 months, she'd played the role of struggling housewife perfectly, wearing drugstore makeup and thrift store clothes, never mentioning the trust fund that generated more in interest each day than Daniel earned in a year. But tonight, something had snapped. His mother emerged from the house with that familiar self-righteous rage, the same woman who'd made his wife's life miserable since the wedding day. But what happened next would shatter everything Daniel thought he knew about power, family, and the woman carrying his child. When his mother spat directly on his wife's face, the pregnant woman didn't flinch. She simply wiped her cheek, made one phone call, and within seconds his mother was shaking so violently she had to grip the doorframe to stay upright, her face drained of all color and conviction. What had his wife said during that brief call? Who was arriving that could reduce his domineering mother to a trembling mess? And why was Daniel suddenly feeling like he'd just made the most catastrophic mistake of his entire life? The October rain fell in sheets, but Daniel barely noticed as he hurled the final suitcase down the front steps of the modest two-story house he'd purchased with a 30-year mortgage. The leather case, which he now realized was Hermes, not the knockoff he'd assumed, tumbled end over end before splashing into a puddle that reflected the warm light spilling from his open front door. Behind him, Victoria's laughter tinkled like wind chimes, her hand possessively gripping his bicep as she leaned into his shoulder, her designer perfume mixing with the scent of rain and wet asphalt. "God, Daniel, I can't believe you put up with her for 3 years," Victoria purred, her voice carrying that particular blend of amusement and cruelty that had once excited him, but now made something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. "Look at her. She's not even fighting back. What kind of woman just stands there?" But Elena wasn't just standing there. Daniel's wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, if he had any say in it, stood at the bottom of the driveway with one hand cradling her 6-month pregnant belly, the other hanging loosely at her side. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and her simple maternity dress, the kind sold at discount stores, clung to her frame. Yet there was something in her posture, something in the way she held her head, that Daniel had never noticed before. She wasn't cowering, she wasn't begging, she was simply observing. 3 years of marriage flashed through Daniel's mind in disjointed fragments. Elena had been a scholarship student at the community college, where he'd been a part-time business instructor, putting himself through his MBA. She'd been quiet, studious, and when she'd smiled at him after class one day, he'd felt like he'd won something. Their courtship had been brief, 6 months before he'd proposed with a modest ring that had taken him 4 months to save for. She'd said yes without hesitation, without demanding something bigger or more expensive, and he'd thought he'd found a woman who understood the value of building something together. But his mother had seen something else entirely. As if summoned by his thoughts, Margaret Harrison appeared in the doorway, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the late hour, her face set in that expression of moral superiority that had defined Daniel's entire childhood. She pushed past Victoria with barely a glance, her eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that made the air feel heavier than the rain could account for. "Finally showing your true colors, are you?" Margaret's voice cut through the sound of rain hitting pavement. "Running away when things get difficult. Typical of someone from your background." Elena's background had always been a mystery that Daniel had never bothered to investigate. She'd mentioned being estranged from her family, something about differing values and expectations, but she'd always changed the subject when pressed. He'd assumed it meant poverty, maybe family dysfunction, something that explained her thrift store wardrobe and her insistence on couponing and budget meals, despite his middle manager salary at Richardson Consulting being more than adequate for a comfortable life. "Mother, maybe we should go inside," Daniel heard himself say, though he wasn't sure why. Victoria's grip on his arm tightened, her perfectly manicured nails digging in slightly. "Don't you dare defend her," Victoria whispered, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not after everything she put you through, making you feel guilty for wanting more, for wanting someone who actually takes care of herself." Margaret descended the porch steps with the bearing of a queen approaching a peasant, her expensive shoes clicking against the wet concrete. Elena didn't move, didn't speak, but something shifted in her eyes, a calculation, a decision being made in real time. "For 3 years," Margaret began, her voice rising with each word, "I have watched you drag my son down. No ambition, no style, no connections. Just a burden he was too kind-hearted to shed. But thank God he's finally found someone worthy of the Harrison name." The rain seemed to fall harder, or maybe Daniel was just becoming more aware of it, of the cold seeping through his expensive Italian loafers, of the way Elena's breathing had become visible in the October air despite her pregnancy. Victoria laughed again, and the sound made Daniel think of breaking glass, of things shattering that couldn't be put back together. Margaret stopped 3 feet from Elena, her face contorted with 3 years of accumulated contempt. "You disgust me," she hissed, and then, with a deliberateness that seemed to slow time itself, she spat directly into Elena's face. The saliva struck Elena's left cheek, just below her eye, and for a moment, one endless, crystallized moment, nobody moved. Daniel felt his stomach drop, felt something crack in his chest that had nothing to do with his relationship with Elena, and everything to do with recognizing that his mother had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But Elena's reaction was what truly stopped his heart. She didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't raise her hand to wipe her face. She smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small curve of her lips that somehow contained more emotion than any expression Daniel had seen on her face in 3 years of marriage. Her hand moved to her pocket. When had she started carrying a phone that looked like it, cost more than his monthly salary, and she raised it to her ear. "Hello, Father," Elena said, her voice calm and clear despite the rain, despite the degradation, despite everything. "I think it's time we had that conversation we've been postponing. Yes, now would be perfect." Margaret's face transformed from triumph to confusion to something Daniel had never seen before on his mother's imperious features, pure, unfiltered fear. Her knees buckled slightly, and she grabbed onto his arm with both hands, her grip vice-like and desperate. "Elena," Margaret whispered, and Daniel realized it was the first time his mother had ever used his wife's actual name instead of "that girl" or "your little mistake." "Elena Wellington?" The world tilted sideways. Wellington. Thomas Wellington. The name on half the buildings downtown. The name that appeared in Forbes' billionaire rankings somewhere in the top 20. The name that meant power, influence, and wealth, beyond anything Daniel's middle-class mind could fully comprehend. His wife, the woman he'd just thrown into the rain, the woman currently being mocked by his mistress, the woman carrying his child, was Thomas Wellington's daughter. Elena finally raised her free hand and wiped the spit from her cheek with a dignity that made Daniel's throat close. 36 months, she said softly, still on the phone but looking directly at Margaret, then at Daniel, then at Victoria. 36 months of testing, of watching, of giving every opportunity for kindness to show itself. Her hand moved to her belly, protective and tender. "Thank you all for showing me exactly who you are." Father? Yes, I'll wait right here. The address? They know it very well. It's the house they thought they were so proud of owning. The black SUVs arrived exactly 14 minutes later, but to Daniel, those 14 minutes felt like falling through ice into water that never reached bottom. He'd spent the first 5 trying to process what Elena had said, the next 4 watching his mother's complete psychological collapse, and the final 5 attempting damage control that felt increasingly like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Victoria had gone silent, her earlier laughter dying the moment Elena said, "Wellington," but she hadn't released Daniel's arm. Her grip had simply transformed from possessive to desperate, like a drowning person clutching driftwood. Margaret had sunk onto the porch steps, rain soaking through her expensive wool coat, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or simply denial. Elena remained standing in the driveway, phone tucked away, one hand on her belly and the other hanging loose at her side. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, but she was thoroughly soaked, her hair hanging in dark ropes down her back, her simple dress clinging to her pregnant frame. Yet somehow she looked more composed than anyone else in this tableau of unraveling lives. The first SUV, a Range Rover that probably cost more than Daniel's annual salary, pulled into the driveway with a quiet authority that made his chest tighten. The second and third vehicles parked along the street, disgorging men in dark suits who moved with military precision to form a perimeter around the property. But it was the fourth vehicle, a Bentley Bentayga that gleamed even in the dim streetlight, that made Margaret's breathing turn ragged and irregular. The driver emerged first, circling to the rear passenger door with an umbrella already deployed. The man who stepped out was in his late 60s, silver-haired and commanding, wearing a suit that Daniel's trained eye recognized as bespoke Savile Row. Easily $15,000, possibly more. Thomas Wellington in the flesh, looking exactly like his Forbes photographs, but somehow more substantial, more real, more terrifying. He didn't acknowledge Daniel, Victoria, or Margaret. His entire focus was on Elena, and as he approached his daughter, the umbrella held carefully above her head by his assistant, his expression cycled through concern, rage, and something that looked almost like pride. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding rooms full of world leaders and corporate titans. "You're soaked through. The baby is fine, Father," Elena replied, and Daniel heard something in her voice he'd never heard in 3 years of marriage. Warmth, genuine affection, the tone of someone speaking to family they actually loved. "I apologize for the dramatic timing, but I think we've reached the end of my social experiment." Thomas Wellington's gaze finally shifted to Daniel, and it felt like being examined under a microscope by someone cataloging a particularly disappointing specimen. "This is the man you chose to test?" His tone carried the weight of profound disappointment mixed with clinical interest. "He seemed kind once," Elena said softly, and something in those words hit Daniel harder than any accusation could have. "At the beginning, before he knew anything about me except what I chose to show him. I thought perhaps, buried under the ambition and the social climbing, there might be genuine decency. I was wrong." A second figure emerged from the Bentley, a woman in her early 60s, elegant in that effortless way that spoke of generations of wealth and refinement. She moved directly to Elena, wrapping a cashmere coat around her daughter's shoulders without a word, her hands gentle, but her eyes, when they swept across Daniel and his family, were glacial. "Catherine," Thomas said to the woman, his voice softening fractionally, "take Elena to the car. I'll handle the cleanup here." But Elena didn't move. "No, Father, I need to witness this. I spent 3 years being invisible in my own marriage. I think I've earned the right to watch them finally see me." Thomas studied his daughter for a long moment, then nodded. He turned to the lead security officer, a man built like a linebacker, but moving with dancer's grace. "Peterson, Retrieve Mrs. Wellington's belongings, all of them, carefully. The shift from Elena to Mrs. Wellington wasn't lost on Daniel. Neither was the implication. She'd never stopped being a Wellington, had never truly become a Harrison in any way that mattered. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as a croak. "Thomas, Mr. Wellington, please, there's been a misunderstanding." "Has there?" Thomas's attention swung to her like a spotlight, and Margaret physically recoiled. "Did you or did you not spit in my pregnant daughter's face approximately 15 minutes ago? Because I have a very detailed account from Elena, and I suspect the security footage from your doorbell camera, yes, I know about that, will corroborate every detail." Daniel's blood turned to ice. The doorbell camera. Victoria had insisted on installing it last month, claiming it was for security. Every word, every action, everything was recorded. "Furthermore," Thomas continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire space with authority that made the air feel thinner, "I have here." He produced a folder from his assistant with practiced ease. "A complete dossier on your financial situation, Mr. Harrison. Your underwater mortgage taken from Richardson Consulting at what I'm sure they considered a competitive rate, but which was actually 17% above market value because you lack financial literacy. Your credit card debt, $47,000 across 6 cards, primarily from maintaining an appearance of wealth you don't possess. Your car lease, your country club membership you can't afford, your mistress's apartment that you've been paying for with cash advances." Each word was a hammer blow. Victoria's grip on Daniel's arm went slack. How did Wellington know about the apartment? Daniel had been so careful using cash, never leaving a paper trail that Elena could find. "Elena knew about all of it," Thomas said, as if reading Daniel's mind. "Did you really think my daughter, educated at Wharton, fluent in 5 languages, holding an MBA in finance, couldn't track household spending? She knew about Miss Victoria within 3 weeks of your first encounter. She knew about every lie, every manipulation, every moment you made her feel small while you inflated your own importance." Daniel tried to speak, but his throat had closed. Beside him, Victoria made a small sound that might have been a whimper. His mother had gone completely still. Her earlier bluster evaporated like rain on summer pavement. "The question Elena posed to me 2 years ago," Thomas continued, "was whether she should reveal herself immediately or wait to see if authentic goodness might emerge. If you might choose love over ambition. If your mother might choose human decency over social climbing. If Miss Victoria might develop a conscience." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "You all failed spectacularly." 2 years? Daniel's voice finally worked, though it came out strangled. "She's known for 2 years?" Elena spoke, her voice steady. "I discovered I was pregnant 14 months into our marriage. That's when I told Father everything. The emotional abuse, Mother Harrison's cruelty, your growing distance. He wanted to intervene immediately, but I asked him to wait. I thought perhaps a child might change things, might remind you of what matters." Her hand moved protectively over her belly. "I gave you all every chance, every opportunity to choose kindness, and tonight, when your mother spat on me while I carried your child, you did nothing. You said nothing. You just stood there with your mistress and watched." The truth of it crashed over Daniel like a physical wave. She was right. In that critical moment when his mother had crossed the ultimate line, he'd frozen. Not out of shock, but out of calculation, already wondering how this scene might play with Victoria, already weighing his mother's approval against his wife's dignity, and he'd chosen wrong. "The house," Thomas said, his tone shifting to business, "is actually owned through a subsidiary of Wellington Holdings. The mortgage you thought you were paying, it goes into a trust fund for Elena. Your salary at Richardson Consulting, that company was acquired by Wellington Enterprises 8 months ago. In essence, Mr. Harrison, you've been living in my daughter's house, working at my company, and feeling superior to the woman who has been subsidizing your entire existence. The ground felt unsteady beneath Daniel's feet. Everything, his job, his house, his sense of self-worth built on being the provider, all of it was an illusion Elena had maintained while he'd treated her like a burden. "You're fired, effective immediately," Thomas continued. "You have 72 hours to vacate this property. My attorneys will be in contact regarding custody arrangements for the child, though given your demonstrated character, or lack thereof, I suspect those will be limited. Miss Victoria, your lease on the apartment at the residences at Harbor Point will not be renewed. Mrs. Harrison," he turned his full attention to Margaret, who seemed to shrink under his gaze, "your membership at Riverside Country Club, which you secured through my daughter's recommendation letter that you believed came from a friend of a friend, revoked. Your position on the hospital charity board. My wife, Catherine, sits on that board's executive committee. I suspect your tenure there is concluded." In less than 5 minutes, Thomas Wellington had dismantled their entire lives with surgical precision, and the terrifying part was how effortless he made it look. Like swatting flies required more effort than destroying everything the Harrison family had built. Peterson and his team had gathered Elena's luggage, loading it carefully into one of the SUVs. Catherine Wellington had draped a second blanket around her daughter, whispering something that made Elena nod. "There's one more thing," Elena said, and Daniel heard his wife, his ex-wife, he supposed, speak with authority he'd never imagined she possessed. "Daniel, I want you to understand something. I didn't stay for 3 years to punish you. I stayed because I genuinely hoped I might be wrong about you, that the man who smiled at me after class, who seemed kind when he had nothing to gain from it, might still exist somewhere. But he doesn't, does he? Maybe he never did." She turned toward the Bentley, her mother's arm around her shoulders, but paused one final time. "I hope your mistress was worth it. I hope your mother's approval keeps you warm at night. And I hope, someday, you learn the difference between a woman's kindness and her weakness, because you just lost the best thing that ever happened to you, and you'll never even fully understand why." Elena Wellington, because that's who she'd always been, never truly Elena. Harrison walked to the Bentley with her head high, her father's protective hand on her back, her mother's quiet support surrounding her. The SUVs pulled away in formation, leaving Daniel standing in the rain with his mistress, his mother, and the ruins of everything he'd thought he'd known. Victoria was the first to break the silence. Did she actually? But Margaret was staring at her hands, shaking her head slowly. "Wellington," she whispered, "we spat on Thomas Wellington's daughter. We spat on Thomas Wellington's pregnant daughter." And Daniel, watching the taillights disappear into the October night, finally understood the true meaning of fear. Not the immediate terror of physical danger, but the slow dawning horror of realizing you've destroyed your own life with your own hands, and there's no one to blame but yourself. The doorbell camera light blinked red, still recording, capturing every moment of their unraveling for posterity. In 72 hours, they'd be homeless. In the morning, he'd be unemployed. And the child his wife carried, his child, would grow up knowing their father had chosen pride over love, appearance over substance, cruelty over kindness. Daniel sank to his knees in the rain, Victoria's hand finally releasing his arm, his mother's quiet weeping providing a soundtrack to the complete destruction of everything he'd thought mattered. He'd never even asked Elena why she worked so hard at being invisible. Never wondered if her thrift might be principle rather than poverty. Never considered that strength could look like patience, that power could masquerade as gentleness. And now, it was too late. 7 months later, Elena sat in the modest pediatrician's waiting room in Portland, Oregon, her 3-month-old daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed. The woman who'd once endured being spat on in the rain now wore comfortable jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face free of makeup. She looked, she thought with some satisfaction, exactly like any other single mother navigating the beautiful chaos of new parenthood, except she was Thomas Wellington's daughter, currently living under the name Elena Martinez in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Portland's Pearl District, driving a 7-year-old Honda Civic and working part-time at a local bookstore called Chapter and Verse. Her father had resisted this particular experiment. "You've already proven your point," he'd argued, but her mother Catherine had understood. "Let her heal," Catherine had told Thomas. "Let her discover who she is outside of being either Mrs. Harrison or Miss Wellington, and if she happens to find someone genuine in the process, all the better." The baby, Sophia Marie, with her mother's dark hair and eyes that might someday turn brown or might stay the blue of her father's, stirred slightly, making the small sounds that Elena had learned meant she'd wake fully in approximately 3 minutes. Right on schedule, as Sophia had been from birth, arriving exactly on her due date like she'd already inherited her mother's sense of precision. "Elena Martinez?" the nurse called from the doorway, her smile warm and genuine. "Dr. Harper is ready for Sophia." Elena gathered the diaper bag, purchased from Target, not Hermes, and followed the nurse down the hallway, noting the cheerful murals of storybook characters that made this practice feel worlds away from the sterile, exclusive pediatrician Margaret Harrison had insisted was the only acceptable choice for a Harrison child. Sophia would never be a Harrison. Elena had made that abundantly clear to her attorneys, who'd negotiated a custody agreement that gave Daniel supervised visitation twice monthly, visits he'd attended exactly 3 times in 3 months before the excuse texts started coming. Work emergency. Feeling under the weather. Something came up. Elena had stopped being surprised and started being grateful. Sophia deserved better than a father who viewed her as an obligation. The examination went smoothly. Sophia was thriving, gaining weight appropriately, meeting all developmental milestones, and Elena was gathering her things when she heard raised voices from the reception area, not quite shouting, but definitely tense, definitely worried. "I'm sorry, sir, but without insurance or payment up front, we can't." "I understand, but my daughter has a fever of 103, and every other clinic has a 2-week wait for new patients. Please, isn't there anything?" Elena paused, Sophia secure in her carrier, and glanced through the doorway. A man stood at the reception desk, probably early 30s, wearing worn jeans and a flannel shirt over a faded t-shirt. He held a little girl who couldn't have been more than 4, her face flushed with fever, her head resting limply on his shoulder. The receptionist looked genuinely sympathetic but was shaking her head, bound by policies Elena knew existed to protect small practices from financial risk. Something in the scene triggered a memory, standing in the rain, invisible and dismissed, while people who claimed to care about propriety and proper behavior showed her exactly how conditional their compassion was. This man's desperation was real, his concern for his daughter palpable, and the receptionist's hands were tied by systems designed to protect businesses rather than people. Elena made a decision that would change everything. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the desk with Sophia's carrier in one hand and her purse in the other. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'd like to cover their visit today." Both the receptionist and the man turned to stare at her. The man's expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been pride fighting with desperation. "No, I can't let you do that. You don't even know us." "I know your daughter needs to see a doctor," Elena replied simply. "And I know what it's like to feel invisible when you need help most. Please, let me do this." The receptionist looked between them, clearly calculating policy against compassion, then seemed to make her own decision. "Dr. Harper actually has an opening right now if you'd like to be seen immediately. And ma'am, if you're sure about covering the cost..." I'm sure, Elena confirmed. Whatever it takes. The man's eyes, she noticed now that she was closer, were a warm brown that matched his daughter's, and they were filling with tears he was clearly trying to contain. Thank you. I don't know what to say. I just moved here 3 weeks ago for a job, and our insurance doesn't start until next month, and Emma woke up this morning burning up, and I've been calling every clinic in the city. You don't have to explain, Elena said gently. Just take care of your daughter. That's what matters. His name, she learned while they waited. Emma was being examined in a room down the hall. Was James Mitchell, recently relocated from Seattle to take a position as a middle school science teacher at a local public school. He was a single father, his wife having passed away from cancer 2 years earlier, leaving him to raise Emma alone. He spoke about his daughter with a tenderness that made Elena's chest ache, describing her love of dinosaurs and her habit of asking impossible questions about how clouds worked and why the ocean was salty. She's my whole world, James said simply, and Elena heard in those 4 words more genuine love than she'd heard in 3 years of marriage to Daniel. When Dr. Harper emerged with Emma, ear infection, already prescribed antibiotics, fever should break within 24 hours, James's relief was so profound it was almost tangible. Elena handled the payment discreetly, charging the visit to a credit card connected to one of her smaller trust funds, the kind of transaction that wouldn't trigger any flags on her father's radar. Please, James said as they walked to the parking lot together, Emma already looking brighter thanks to children's Tylenol and the reassurance of medical attention. Let me pay you back. I can set up a payment plan, whatever works. I have your number from the form. Consider it a welcome to Portland gift, Elena interrupted. Pay it forward someday when you're able. That's all I ask. But James was looking at her with an intensity that suggested he saw more than she'd intended to show. You're not just being kind. There's something else. Something about the way you said you know what it's like to feel invisible. He paused, then added carefully, Bad divorce? Elena laughed, surprised by his perceptiveness. Is it that obvious? I recognize the look, he said softly. The relief of being away from something that hurt. The cautiousness about trusting again. I wore that expression for about a year after Lisa died. Different circumstances, but the same wariness about opening up. They'd reached her Honda, and Elena was buckling Sophia's carrier into the base when James noticed the baby for the first time. His expression softened immediately. And you're doing this alone too. Single motherhood and handling random strangers' medical bills. You're either independently wealthy or completely reckless with money. Maybe a little of both, Elena said, which was technically true in ways James couldn't begin to imagine. Let me at least buy you coffee, James offered. As a thank you, there's a place 2 blocks from here. Chapter and Verse has a cafe in the back. Best lattes in Portland, and they're very baby-friendly. Elena's heart did a small flip. I actually work at Chapter and Verse, part-time, mostly morning shifts. James's face lit up with genuine pleasure. No kidding. Emma and I were there last weekend. She found a book about dinosaurs that she's been reading every night since. The woman who helped us. Wait, was that you? It had been. Elena remembered them now. The patient father letting his daughter take 40 minutes to choose just the right book, reading passages aloud to her with different voices for different dinosaurs, completely unaware that other customers were waiting or that he looked slightly ridiculous making T-Rex sounds in the children's section. That was me, Elena confirmed. Emma has excellent taste. That's one of our best sellers. Then coffee is definitely happening, James declared. I owe you for both the medical bill and for enabling Emma's dinosaur obsession. How's tomorrow morning? I could bring Emma by after I drop her at preschool, around 9:30. Something in Elena whispered caution. She'd just escaped one relationship built on false pretenses, and here she was, setting up what could. be interpreted as a date while hiding her entire identity. But something else, something that had been dormant for months, whispered that James Mitchell had just paid for his daughter's medical care with money he clearly couldn't spare, while simultaneously worrying about paying back a stranger. And that kind of integrity was rare enough to be worth exploring. 9:30 works, she said. I'll save you the good table by the window. As she drove home, Sophia sleeping peacefully in the back seat, Elena caught herself smiling in a way she hadn't smiled in years. Not the careful, measured smile of someone playing a role, but the genuine expression of someone who'd just met another human being and felt the possibility of real connection. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Your father wants to know when you're coming home. I told him to stop hovering. How's my granddaughter? Elena typed back, Sophia's perfect, and I think I might stay in Portland. A bit longer? I like the bookstore, the pace, the anonymity. The coffee date with James wasn't planned. The attraction she'd felt watching him parent his daughter with such devoted tenderness wasn't calculated, and for the first time since she'd stood in the rain watching her old life crumble, Elena felt like she might be building something real, not as Wellington's daughter or Harrison's discarded wife, but simply as herself. She didn't know that James Mitchell lived paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment, budgeting carefully to give Emma the best life possible on a teacher's salary. She didn't know that he'd spent the previous night at the emergency room with Emma before being turned away due to lack of insurance, desperately Googling home remedies for high fever while his daughter cried. She didn't know that her intervention today had quite possibly saved him from having to choose between rent and health care. And James didn't know that the kind woman who'd paid for his daughter's medical care was worth more than he'd earn in 10 lifetimes, or that she was testing him just as thoroughly as she'd tested the husband who'd failed. But unlike Daniel Harrison, James Mitchell was about to pass every test Elena could devise, not through calculation or performance, but through the simple act of being genuinely, consistently, beautifully kind. The question was, how long would Elena wait before revealing who she really was? And would James's feelings survive the revelation when it finally came? The apartment door opened and James appeared, his smile transforming into concern when he saw her expression. Hey, what's wrong? Did something happen with Sophia? The girls are fine, Elena said quickly. They're both asleep on the couch. Emma's holding Sophia's hand. It's adorable, and you should take a picture, but first... She held up the ring box. Your phone wasn't in your jacket pocket. James's face went through several expressions. Surprise, embarrassment, resignation, and finally a rueful smile. Well, that's not how I planned this conversation going, but I suppose we're doing this now. He crossed the small office and took the box gently from her hands. I was going to wait until next weekend. There's this spot at Powell's bookstore, the rare book room on the 3rd floor where we had our first real date, remember? I was going to take you there and tell you that you're the best thing that's happened to me since Emma was born and ask if you'd consider making this permanent. James, Elena's voice cracked. Let me finish, he said softly. I know I can't give you the kind of life you might want. I'm a teacher. I'll always be a teacher because I love it, even though it means we'd have to budget carefully and probably never take fancy vacations or live in a big house. But I promise I would spend every day trying to make you happy. I'd be the best father I could be to Sophia, and Emma already loves you like you're her mom, and Elena, I love you. I love everything about you, and if you need more time, I understand, but I needed you to know. The tears Elena had been holding back finally fell, but she was smiling through them. Before you say anything else, before you ask me anything official, I need to tell you something. Actually, I need to show you something. She pulled out her phone, not the basic smartphone James knew, but the iPhone she kept in her purse for emergency contact with her family, and pulled up a photo. It showed a younger version of herself at what was clearly a high society charity gala, wearing a gown that cost more than James's annual salary, standing between Thomas and Catherine Wellington, with a caption identifying her as Elena Wellington, daughter of business magnate Thomas Wellington. James stared at the photo, looked at Elena, looked back at the photo. Is this photoshopped? Is this someone who looks like you? That's me, Elena said quietly. My real name is Elena Catherine Wellington. My father is Thomas Wellington. Yes, that Thomas Wellington. I've been living in Portland under my mother's maiden name for the past 2 years because I needed to know. I needed to know if someone could love me for who I am, not what I'm worth. The silence stretched between them, and Elena watched James's face carefully, looking for the calculation. She'd seen in Daniel's eyes the sudden shift from affection to opportunism, but what she saw instead was processing, confusion, and then something that looked almost like hurt. 2 years, James said slowly. We've been together for 1.5 years, and you've been lying to me the entire time. Not lying, Elena protested, though she knew how weak it sounded. Just not telling the whole truth. Everything else was real. My feelings, my life here, the bookstore job, that's all real. The only thing I hid was my family and my financial situation. The only thing? James's voice rose slightly, careful not to wake the girls but carrying genuine emotion. Elena, I've been agonizing for months about whether I could afford to marry you, whether it was fair to ask you to live on a teacher's salary. I've been saving every spare dollar for this ring. He held up the box. While you've been secretly a billionaire, do you have any idea how that makes me feel? Like you've been passing a test you didn't know you were taking, Elena admitted. And I know how awful that sounds. I know it seems manipulative and unfair, and maybe it is. But James, my first husband, he threw my luggage in the rain while his mistress laughed, and his mother spat on me when I was 6 months pregnant. People who claimed to love me showed me exactly how conditional that love was the moment I became inconvenient. She moved closer to him, her voice breaking. I needed to know you were different. And you are. You've proven it 1,000 times over. The way you insisted on paying for dates you couldn't afford because you wanted to contribute equally. The way you apologized to Sophia when you accidentally woke her, like she was a person whose feelings mattered even though she couldn't talk yet. The way you spent 4 hours helping Mrs. Chen from the bookstore move apartments on your Saturday off because she mentioned she was worried about the cost of movers. You didn't do any of that because you knew who I really was. You did it because that's who you are. James was quiet for a long moment, the ring box still in his hand, his expression unreadable. Then he said something Elena wasn't expecting. Does Emma know? No, Elena said immediately. I would never involve a child in this without talking to you first. But James, I want to tell her. I want to tell everyone. I'm tired of hiding. I want my parents to meet you. Actually meet you, not run background checks on you. I want you to understand that when I say yes to marrying you, it won't be despite your teacher's salary. It'll be because you're the man who spent 40 minutes in the bookstore children's section making dinosaur sounds for his daughter. Because you're the man who cried when Sophia called you Dada for the first time even though she's not yours. Because you're kind and patient and real in ways I didn't think existed anymore. When you say yes, James caught the phrase, a small smile starting to break through his hurt. When, Elena confirmed, because I love you, James Mitchell. I love you exactly as you are, doing exactly what you do, living exactly the life you've chosen. I don't want to change anything about you, but I do want to share my life with you, all of it. The trust funds and the family legacy, and yes, the wealth that comes with being a Wellington. Not to change who you are, but to give you choices. To let you teach because you love it, not because you have to. To make sure Emma has everything she needs, without you lying awake at night doing budget calculations. To build a life together where neither of us has to pretend to be anything other than exactly who we are. James set the ring box on the desk and pulled Elena into his arms, his face buried in her hair. She felt his shoulders shaking and realized he was crying, not from sadness but from the overwhelming emotion of everything shifting beneath his feet. "I don't want your money," he said into her hair. "I need you to know that. I fell in love with you when I thought you worked in a bookstore and drove a beat-up Honda. That's not changing just because I now know your father could buy the bookstore chain without noticing the expense." "I know," Elena whispered. "That's why I'm telling you now. That's why I know you're safe." They stood like that for several minutes, holding each other, while two little girls slept peacefully in the next room, unaware that their lives were about to transform in ways both subtle and profound. Finally, James pulled back, wiped his eyes, and picked up the ring box again. "This proposal is not going the way I planned at all, but I'm apparently committed to this chaotic approach now, so..." He dropped to one knee in the tiny bookstore office, looking up at Elena with eyes that held love and hurt and hope and humor all mixed together. Elena Catherine Wellington, formerly Martinez, formerly Harrison, and wow, we need to talk about that whole story later. Will you marry me? Not for your money, which I'm still processing, not despite my lack of money, which you apparently don't care about, but because somewhere between a pediatrician's waiting room and now, you became my person, my partner, the one I want to figure out life with, whatever that life looks like. Elena was laughing and crying simultaneously, nodding before he even finished speaking. Yes, absolutely yes, to all of it. The ring slid onto her finger, simple and perfect, and chosen with love by a man who'd saved for months to buy it, not knowing that his future wife could buy the entire jewelry store without checking her account balance. And somehow, that made it more precious than any ring her father's money could have purchased. "We should wake the girls," Elena said, admiring how the ring caught the light. "And then I need to call my parents. Fair warning, my father is going to offer you things. Trust funds for Emma, endowed chairs at whatever school you want to teach at, houses and cars and opportunities. You're allowed to say no to all of it." "But I'm also allowed to say yes to some of it," James asked carefully. "Because I'd be lying if I said the idea of not worrying about Emma's college fund doesn't appeal to me." "You're allowed to say yes to whatever feels right," Elena confirmed. "This is a partnership, James. We figure it out together." 6 months later, they married in a ceremony that perfectly blended both their worlds, held at the Wellington estate but decorated by Emma and Sophia with hand-painted flowers, catered by the best chefs money could hire, but featuring dinosaur-shaped cookies that James insisted on making himself. Thomas Wellington walked Elena down the aisle, but it was Emma who carried the rings, proud and serious in her role as big sister and junior bridesmaid. Daniel Harrison read about the wedding in Forbes magazine, seeing his ex-wife's glowing smile next to a man the article identified as a Portland public school teacher who captured the heart of one of America's most eligible heiresses. The photo showed Elena laughing, clearly mid-sentence, while her new husband looked at her with adoration so obvious it was almost uncomfortable to witness. In the background, two little girls played with flower petals, one dark-haired like her mother, one lighter-haired like her father, both beloved. Daniel had remarried as well, Victoria in a hasty ceremony 6 months after his divorce finalized, but they were already separated, his mother's money having run out and Victoria's interest evaporating along with it. He worked now at a car dealership, selling mid-range sedans to people who reminded him uncomfortably of who he used to be. But Elena never thought about Daniel anymore. She was too busy with her real life, helping James prepare lesson plans at their Portland home. They'd kept the modest apartment and bought a comfortable house in a good school district, rejecting her father's offers of mansions in favor of a place where their daughters could play in the yard. She still worked at chapter and verse 3 days a week, despite her father's bewilderment, because she loved the quiet satisfaction of connecting readers with books. And every night she fell asleep next to a man who loved her, not for the Wellington name or the trust funds or the social connections, but because she made him laugh, understood his passion for teaching, and had once paid for his daughter's medical care when he desperately needed help. On their first anniversary, James gave her a framed photo from that day in the pediatrician's office. He'd tracked down security footage and had a single frame printed and matted. It showed Elena approaching the reception desk, Sophia in her carrier, her expression determined but gentle, while James held a feverish Emma, desperation and hope warring on his face. "This is the moment," James wrote on the back, "when everything good in my life began." Elena hung it in her office at the Wellington Foundation headquarters, where she now ran a charitable program providing healthcare access to uninsured families, inspired by a desperate father and a feverish little girl who'd given her back her faith in human goodness. And if sometimes she thought about a younger version of herself, standing in the rain, pregnant and degraded, watching her old life crumble, she felt only gratitude. That woman's pain had taught her how to recognize real love when it finally arrived, not in the expensive clothes or grand gestures or social climbing, but in dinosaur sounds and split checks and a ring that represented 3 months of careful saving from a man who loved her before he knew she was worth loving. Some tests, Elena reflected, were worth administering, and some people were worth the wait.